Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a nice 8-game college basketball slate that starts at 8 p.m. All of these games look really solid. There's only one game that's really at super risk of a blowout, and that's Arizona against Oregon State. Some of the other games are very tight, and most of these games have a points of somewhere between 128 and 142. So everything is relatively tight. So all the teams have players that are viable on the slate. Some more than others, but overall, it's a really good slate. I really do like it. There's a lot of good value plays in the guard position as well. Not so much in the forwards, but overall, it's a really solid slate. I think it's a good slate to mix and match some of the high price guys with some cheaper options. And so, with that said, let's get into the guards first. We're going to start with Drew Peterson for USC here. Now, he has none of the guards really have a ton of consistency when it comes to the expensive guys, but he does have a good matchup here, and he has some good upside. He's a little bit, he has a lower floor than I like most of the time, but if you're just looking for a slightly more expensive guard, he's going to be somebody that's worth taking a look at. At his price point, $8,400, we do need him to score around 33 fantasy points today. And in the last 20 days, he's been averaging around 34 fantasy points a game, and he has some decent upside here. He's also averaging 0.91 fantasy points per minute, so he's definitely viable on the slate and a good matchup. Then we're going to look at Wade Taylor for Texas A&M. Now, he is slightly cheaper than Drew Peterson with similar potential. What I mean by that is comparing his price. Like if Drew Peterson was $8,400 and Wade Taylor is $7,600, they have the same kind of upside based on what they need to do. Basically, Wade Taylor needs to get around 28 fantasy points, and he's kind of in line for around 26 to 30 over the last 20 days, and he has got some good upside as well, around 34, 35 fantasy points. He's also averaging 0.92 fantasy points per game, so he and Drew Peterson are both good options. If I had to pick one, I would take Wade Taylor simply because he's a little bit less expensive and will allow us to pay up more for some other players. Then we're going to look at Alex Ducasse for St. Mary's against Gonzaga. This is a tough matchup, but he has big-time upside here for the price. He has a very low floor when he doesn't shoot the ball well, but overall, this is a very interesting play with the matchup. This game should be tight. St. Mary is actually favored to win right now. I'm not sure that they will, but he should have a good full complement of minutes and good opportunity here. He does need about 22 fantasy points to pay off for us today, and he has been averaging around 24, 25 fantasy points the last 20 days with a ceiling in the mid-30s. So he has some really good upside here. I really think he's a viable option on the slate. And you could also actually mix him into the forward position if you need to, though I do think that he's probably better used in the guard position overall, if you choose to use him. Joe Chesant for West Virginia also looks really interesting today at $4,900. He comes off the bench playing around 20 minutes a game. He has some good upside here, but he does sometimes get limited by fouls. But he does need about 20 fantasy points for him to pay off here for us. But he has been getting around that per game all season long, in fact, as well as the last 20 games. And he has some big-time upside. He has 35-plus fantasy point upside. So he definitely looks interesting from that perspective. And similar to Ducasse, he's averaging at 0.79 fantasy points per minute. I think both of those guys are very viable on the slate and good mid-range options if you need mid-range availability. Then we're going to look at Severe Wheeler. Now, this is extremely dependent on the injury situation for Kentucky. If Cason Wallace misses, then he would be very viable to play today. But we do have to make sure he is going to be out before we use Severe. But if Severe starts, he will be a must-play, auto-locked for the slate. He has dominated Florida for 22 or more fantasy points, 6 out of 6 matchups against them as a starter. So if he does start today, he will be, I would call him an automatic start. He does need about 18 fantasy points for him to pay off today, which he is more than capable of doing if he comes off the bench even. But overall, I do think he does need him to start if he's going to be a viable option on the slate. He's averaging 0.64 fantasy points per minute, and he's just too cheap for what he can do if he ends up starting. So I think he's viable. We'll have to wait and see about the injury situation with Cason Wallace, however. Then we're going to look at USC and look at Trey White. Now, he is $4,400. He does start most games, and he plays good minutes. He really gets under 12 fantasy points per minute. He's one of my favorite overall value plays on the slate. He's a very safe option. He needs 16 fantasy points to pay off for us today, and he's averaging 16 fantasy points for the last 20 days. In fact, he's averaging about 20 fantasy points throughout the season. He averages 0.66 fantasy points per minute, but he has some nice upside here, and the risk here is that, obviously he could score under 10 fantasy points, which would hurt us, but as long as he gets over 10, we're going to be happy at this very reduced price. And for that matter, he's in a plus matchup when it comes to the team that he's on is favored to win by about 10 points. So he should get plenty of minutes and have a good opportunity here. He's one of my favorite plays on the slate in general. Then we're going to look at Rivaldo. Sorry about that. Sorayas for Oregon. Sorry if I saying your name wrong. Now he's only at $3,800. He starts and plays good minutes, but he does tend to be a bit streaky. He doesn't have as much upside as Trey White does, but he still has a good floor. And while he does have some games under 10 fantasy points, a little bit more than I'd like, his price is cheap enough that he's worth the risk here, I think, if you want to pay down so that you can afford Oscar Tshiebwe or some of the other options at forward. So then we're going to go over to the forwards now, and I've got 4 guys picked here, and you can kind of mix and match these 4 guys any way you want in order to, fit into this 3 forward spot here. I think that's probably the best way to go about it. Or you could even use Alec Dukas as a forward as well and go with more guards. But overall, we're going to start with Oscar Tshiebwe, who's obviously one of the most expensive players available. He is a double-double machine. He gets double-doubles almost every single game. He's priced up to it due to that consistency, and he will definitely need a double-double to pay off here at $10,000. But he's actually cheaper than he's been as of late. He needs 40 fantasy points to really pay off here, and he definitely has that potential. He has the biggest ceiling on the slate where he can get over 70 fantasy points given days. And if you look at last season when he played against Florida, he averaged 27 points and 17 rebounds, which is absolutely insane. He scored 55 and 60 fantasy points against Florida last year. If he comes anywhere close to that, you're going to love rostering him today. And so I think he's set, ready to go. He's averaging a 1.12 fantasy points per minute as well, which is absolutely ridiculous. Then we're going to look at Azulis Tubelis for Arizona. Now, sorry for butchering your name, but his price point is really interesting today, considering the fact that they're favored to win their game by about 19 points. That could limit him a little bit minutes-wise. And as you can see, there's been some games this season where he's had foul trouble as well as blowout situations where, he played less minutes as overall, in the mid-20s. But I don't necessarily think that's going to happen here. He's got some big-time upside. Even if the game does blow out, they're going to probably keep him in there. He's a double-double machine as well. Not quite to the level that Oscar Tshiebwe is, but he's got the same kind of double-double mentality the last 9 games. He's had 7 double-doubles in the last 9 games. And you can say exactly the same thing for Oscar. He has big-time upside here. Obviously, his upside isn't quite as high as Tshiebwe's, but he does have the last 20 games around the same fantasy points per game as Oscar does at 42. He also needs about 2 or 3 points less to pay off for us, but he does need to have bigger, he doesn't have the big-time upside that Oscar has, where he can score, 70-something points, but he can still get in the mid-60s on big days, and so I think he's viable on the slate. And the last, he has had 2 38 fantasy point games in the last 2 matchups against Oregon State, so he has a pretty safe floor for the matchup, despite the fact that it is a blowout risk. Then we're going to look at Colin Castleton for Florida. Excuse me. Now, I wish he was a little bit cheaper than he is at $8,900, but this matchup between him and Oscar Tshiebwe should be absolutely fun to watch. I could see both these guys going for over 30 fantasy points in this one. I do wish Castleton was a little bit cheaper, like I said, but overall, we need him to get around 35, 36 fantasy points for him to pay off for us, and he is capable of doing this, but it's not as likely, and he has a pretty tight ceiling. Like, he's probably not going to get over 40 fantasy points, so that is a little bit of a risk here. But overall, he is viable on the slate. He's averaging 1.1 fantasy point per minute. But if I had to choose between him and the two other guys I already mentioned, I would pick the other two, Oscar being the top option. But then finally, we're going to get to Dante from Oregon. Now, he has an interesting situation here, obviously, with this game being relatively tight. Both teams, I think, are projected to actually tie currently at 70.25 points overall. And I really like his situation and matchup. He is back from injury, and he tends to play minutes in the mid-20s, and he should be good to go here. He has a good floor, he has a high ceiling, and he needs to get about 29 fantasy points for him to pay off for us, and he's averaging 28 fantasy points on the season, and he's got some upside that's around the mid-30s, and so I think he's viable here as a cheaper forward. Not super cheap, obviously, but a cheaper one. Obviously, we're going to try to pay up for forwards and pay down at guards and utility. And quite frankly, I think you're going to use a lot of guards today. It's just a guard-heavy slate, and there's not a ton of forwards that really look all that great for their prices. So that's what I have for this slate. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you guys for liking, commenting, subscribing, and have a nice day, guys.